Welcome, dear listeners. I'm here with a story that will take away all the fatigue of the day. If you're subscribed, the story begins. Chapter 1. The clock never stopped. The rain falling on London that night was heavier than usual. It was the last week of November, and the city was covered in a grey blanket, the flickering lights of the street lamps dancing on the wet pavement. In the quiet streets of Bloomsbury, it was well past 11 o'clock, and in most of the respectable houses, the curtains were drawn and the fires were dying out. On the second floor of the 3-story brick building on Albemarle Street, notary Samuel Drayton's study was brightly lit that night. At least that's how the maid Martha remembered it. Her master liked to work at night. He would rummage through old case files, examine sealed envelopes, and sometimes not leave his room until morning. So Martha wasn't worried when she saw the light filtering under the door that night. Even when she climbed the stairs carrying the breakfast tray at 7 the next morning, she didn't suspect anything was wrong. She knocked on the door. There was no answer. She knocked again. Still silence. She turned the handle and the door creaked open. The sound of the tray falling from her hands shattered the silence of Albemarle Street that morning. Samuel Drayton was sitting at the oak table, leaning back in his chair. His eyes were fixed on the ceiling, but they saw nothing. His face wore a blank expression, and there was a dried foam mark at the corner of his lips. His hands rested on the table as if he had been about to write something, but there was no paper in front of him. Only an empty inkwell and an overturned pen. When Martha's screams echoed through the street, the rain was still falling. Inspector Lestrade from Scotland Yard arrived at the scene before noon. He was accompanied by 2 police officers and a doctor. The doctor examined the body, took notes, and stood up, frowning. "Poisoning," he said in a low voice. "Probably arsenic or something similar. The autopsy will give the definitive result, but the symptoms are quite clear." Lestrade scanned the room. Everything was in its place. The bookshelves were neatly arranged, the files labelled, not a single wrinkle in the carpet. There were no signs of a struggle, no evidence of a fight, no forced entry. "The doors and windows?" Lestrade asked. "They were all locked from the inside, sir," said one of the young officers. "The maid found the door unlocked when she opened it, but she swears no one entered the house during the night." Lestrade scratched his chin thoughtfully. "What about the victim's financial situation?" This question shed light on a dark corner of Samuel Drayton's life. Over the next few hours, Lestrade and his team confronted disturbing truths about the notary's final years. Drayton appeared to be a respectable notary from the outside, but the books told a different story. Bad investments, lost lawsuits, suspicious movements of client funds. And most importantly, a massive debt to a moneylender named Leonard Vance. £600, Lestrade said, examining the promissory note. This man was up to his neck in debt. The doctor cleared his throat. "Are you considering suicide, Inspector?" Lestrade shrugged. "Debts, shame, hopelessness. We've seen it before. The man may have taken his own life. But still." He didn't finish his sentence, instead walking to the window and staring at the rain-streaked glass. "Still, some things don't add up." "What kind of things?" "I don't know," said Lestrade. "A feeling, maybe nothing." But a voice inside him whispered that this wasn't as simple as it seemed. The next day, a short article appeared on page 3 of the Times. "Respected notary found dead in Bloomsbury. suspected suicide. The article consisted of just a few paragraphs and could easily have been lost in London's crowded crime news agenda at the time. But for the man sitting in the armchair opposite the fireplace at 221 B. Baker Street, the news carried a very different meaning. When Sherlock Holmes placed the newspaper on the table, there was a familiar expression on his face. Dr. John Watson had seen that expression countless times over the years, a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and mental awakening. "What did you find?" Watson asked, sipping his coffee. Holmes handed the newspaper to Watson. "Read this article and tell me your thoughts." Watson quickly scanned the article. A notary committed suicide. He had debts. Sad, but unfortunately not uncommon. "What's the big deal?" "Nothing," said Holmes. "And everything. Isn't there a detail that catches your attention?" Watson read the article again, this time more carefully. "No, as far as I can see, it's a standard suicide case." Holmes smiled slightly, but there was no joy in his smile. "That's precisely why it interests me, Watson. It's too standard, too neat, too prepared." "What do you mean?" Holmes stood up and walked to the window. The rain had stopped outside, but the sky was still leaden. A man is £600 in debt. He feels ashamed, he feels helpless, and he poisons himself. It's logical, isn't it? The police think so. The newspaper says so. Everyone will accept it. "And you?" Holmes turned and looked at Watson. There was that familiar gleam in his eyes. "I, my friend, accept nothing. Not yet. To jump to conclusions without going to the scene, without seeing the evidence, without smelling the room. That's not my way." Watson set down his cup. "Will you inform Lestrade?" "I already did. I sent a note half an hour ago. He should be waiting for us." And so, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Holmes and Watson found themselves in front of that brick building on Albemarle Street. Samuel Drayton's study looked genuinely clean to Holmes at first glance. Everything was in its place, just as Lestrade had described. But for Holmes, in its place was sometimes the biggest clue. "Leave me alone," said Holmes as he stepped into the room. "Half an hour, maybe an hour. No one is to enter." Lestrade wanted to protest, but years of experience silenced him. Everyone, including Watson, left the room and the door closed behind them. Holmes stood in the middle of the room and closed his eyes. First, he listened. Silence. But not complete silence. From somewhere, a rhythmic sound was coming. Tick-tock, tick-tock, a clock. He opened his eyes and searched for the source of the sound. In the left corner of the wall, next to the bookcase, hung an antique wall clock. The clock was still working. The pendulum swung, the mechanism ticked. Holmes approached the clock and examined it carefully. From the outside, it was an ordinary Victorian wall clock. An oak case, a brass dial, Roman numerals. But Holmes's eye caught a faint scratch mark on the lower edge of the dial. Then he looked at the side of the case. There were scratches there too. Someone had opened the cover of this clock recently. He took off his gloves and ran his fingertips along the edges of the case. He found a latch and pressed it gently. The cover opened, revealing the clock's mechanism. Holmes's eyebrows furrowed. The mechanism had been altered. A small metal cylinder had been added next to the original parts. There were fine grooves on the cylinder, and these grooves, Holmes noticed when he looked closely. It was a sound recording cylinder, similar to Edison's phonograph technology, but much smaller, much more sophisticated. "Interesting," Holmes murmured to himself. He carefully removed the cylinder and put it in his pocket. Then he looked at the position of the clock. He climbed down from the wall, knelt on the floor, and examined the carpet. On the carpet, just below the clock, there was a rectangular mark. A slight difference in colour, as if something had been there for a long time and then removed. Holmes stood up and scanned the room again. The position of the desk, the angle of the window, the distance to the door. He mapped it all in his mind. Then he walked over to the desk and sat down in the chair where Drayton had been sitting. He was looking at the clock from here. Drayton must have been looking at this clock in his final moments. But why? What could a clock mean to a man about to die? Holmes scanned the area around the desk. There was no paper on it. However, the inkwell looked as if it had been used recently. This inconsistency was enough to make him look down at the floor. He noticed a small piece of paper tucked into the edge of the carpet, squeezed into the shadow of the furniture. It must have been torn carelessly and fallen to the floor in haste. Holmes bent down and picked up the piece. The ink had smudged, and most of the lines were broken. However, a few words were still legible. Confession and witness. Holmes put the paper in his pocket. The rest of the writing was missing, but its meaning was abundantly clear. Then he began testing the room's acoustics. He whispered, spoke, and called out from different corners. He noted how the sound spread, where it echoed, and where it was absorbed. This room was like a confession room. Drayton had talked at length before he died. Holmes could understand that. The water glass on the table was empty, and there were lip marks on the inside rim, indicating that someone who'd been talking for hours had tried to quench their thirst. But who had Drayton been talking to? There was no one else in the room. The maid swore that no one had entered the house that night. So was Drayton alone? Holmes turned to the clock. That small cylinder. Someone had made Drayton talk and recorded it. But how? Why? An hour later, when Holmes opened the door, Lestrade and Watson were waiting outside. "Did you find anything?" Lestrade asked hopefully. Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he asked for the maid Martha to be called. The old woman came into the room, her eyes red, her hands trembling. "Martha," Holmes said gently, "I need to ask you a few questions. Don't be afraid. You're not being accused of anything. I'm just trying to understand some things." Martha nodded. "That night, did you hear any sounds coming from your master's room? Talking, arguing, anything?" Martha thought for a moment. "Yes, sir. Master Drayton was speaking, but..." "But?" "There was only one voice. Just my master's voice. He talked for hours. Even after midnight, before I retired to my room, I heard him talking, but no one was answering him." Holmes nodded. "Thank you, Martha. That was very helpful." After the woman left, Lestrade impatiently asked, "What does this mean? The man talked to himself for hours. He might have been blaming himself before committing suicide, feeling guilty." "No," Holmes said firmly. "This isn't a suicide. This is a murder." Lestrade's eyes widened. "Murder? But how? No one entered the room." Holmes pulled the voice cylinder from his pocket and showed it to Lestrade. The killer didn't need to enter the room. The killer made Drayton talk from a distance. He listened to him. He recorded his confession. And then he probably administered the poison much earlier, without being noticed. Maybe in a gift, maybe in a drink. Drayton may have taken the poison days before that night. It was a slow-acting poison. Watson interrupted in astonishment. But that's a very complicated plan. Who could do such a thing? Holmes walked to the window and looked out. Someone wanted a confession from Drayton, not just to kill him, but to make him confess first. This isn't an ordinary murder, Watson. This is a trial, Lestrade asked. A trial? Holmes turned and looked at both of them. His face bore a dark expression. This clock, he said, pointing to the wall clock, didn't measure time. It measured a confession. A deep silence fell over the room. Outside, the first stars were beginning to appear in London's grey sky. And in that silence, the pendulum of the wall clock still swung. Tick-tock, 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 as if waiting for something. That evening, Leonard Vance was arrested. The loan shark flew into a rage when he heard the police were charging him with the murder of Samuel Drayton. "I didn't kill that man," he shouted as two police officers dragged him to the station. "I just wanted my money, my £600. Lestrade personally conducted Vance's interrogation. The man was middle-aged, overweight, and constantly sweating. His eyes held a mixture of fear and anger. "When was the last time you saw Drayton?" Lestrade asked. 3 days ago, said Vance, his voice trembling. "I went to his office. I asked for my money. He asked me for 2 more weeks. I agreed, that's all." "Did you threaten him?" Vance hesitated. I just said I wanted my money. I said that if he didn't pay, I would make it public." "But kill him?" "No. I'm a loan shark, not a murderer. I can't get money from a dead man, can I?" Holmes stood in a corner, listening quietly. He analysed Vance's every word, every gesture, every facial expression. The man was lying, yes, but not about the murder. Probably about other things, perhaps tax evasion or illegal interest rates. But the fear in his eyes was real. Leonard Vance hadn't killed Samuel Drayton. Holmes knew this, but he hadn't said it yet, because the real killer was still out there and Holmes wanted to wait for his next move. That night at 221B Baker Street, Holmes sat in front of the fireplace, deep in thought. Watson sat in the chair opposite him, trying to read a book, but his friend's silence was unsettling him. "Holmes," he finally said, "what's on your mind?" Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he took out the cylinder and placed it in a small device on the table. A phonograph adapter, his own design. "Listen," he said. He turned on the device. The first few seconds were noise. Then a voice emerged. Samuel Drayton's voice. Shaky, frightened, but also somehow relieved. "I confess. 20 years ago, I lied in court. I testified and caused the deaths of innocent men. Arthur Mercer, James, Holloway, Peter Crane. They were innocent. We all knew it, but still..." The voice trailed off. Watson looked at Holmes in horror. What does this mean?" Holmes turned off the phonograph and turned to Watson with dark eyes. "This, Watson, is the beginning of the end of a 20-year lie. Samuel Drayton was a witness, a false witness, and someone found him, made him confess and killed him. What about the others? Drayton said we all knew. Are there others?" Holmes shook his head, his face cold. "Yes, and I fear the killer hasn't finished yet." The fire crackled in the fireplace. Outside, the rain had started again, and in a dark room in a corner of London, a man was looking at a list. There were 4 names on the list. 1 was crossed out. 3 names remained. Chapter 2. The lie in the mirror. 5 days had passed. London had long forgotten Samuel Drayton's death. The newspapers had moved on to new scandals, new murders, new gossip. The loan shark Leonard Vance was still in custody, but without solid evidence, his release was imminent. Lestrade was nervous. Holmes was silent. During those 5 days, Holmes hardly left his room on Baker Street. Watson had seen his friend like this before. Not eating, not sleeping, just thinking. The walls were covered with maps, notes, and newspaper clippings. One name stood out: Arthur Mercer, a man executed 20 years ago. "Who is this Arthur Mercer?" Watson had asked at the end of the second day. "A ghost," Holmes replied, "or at least one for someone. 20 years ago, a murder was committed in East London. 3 men were accused: Arthur Mercer, James Holloway, and Peter Crane. The court found them guilty. All 3 were hanged." "And did Drayton testify in that case?" "Yes, but it's not just him. He said all of us in the recording. There are other witnesses, and someone is finding them." Watson shuddered. "Is it revenge?" Holmes didn't answer. He just looked at the names on the wall. On the morning of the 5th day, the answer came. Dorset Street, one of Whitechapel's slums, represented the dark side of London. Narrow streets, dilapidated buildings, suspicious shadows. But the 3-story house at the end of the street was different from its surroundings. It was well kept, painted, and clearly belonged to a wealthy man. Victor Hale was a 52-year-old businessman. He had made his fortune in the coal trade. His wife had died 5 years earlier, and he had no children. He lived alone, employing only a cook and a butler. That morning, when the butler, Geoffrey Stern, brought breakfast to his master's room, he found the door locked. There was no sound coming from inside. When Stern broke down the door, he found Victor Hale on the floor, covered in blood. The man had been stabbed. He had a deep wound in his chest. But what was strange was the state of the room. Nothing was out of place. The chairs were where they belonged, the tables were neat, the bookshelves untouched. Only Victor Hale was dead. And even in death there was a strange expression on his face. Not fear, acceptance. When Lestrade heard the news, he rushed straight to Holmes. "Another murder," he said, panting as he entered Baker Street. "And this time there's no doubt the man was stabbed." Holmes took his hat and coat. "Let's go." The house on Dorset Street told Holmes something at first glance. Like its owner, it appeared strong from the outside, but something was rotting inside. When they arrived at the scene, the police officers had not yet removed the body. Holmes asked for permission and entered the room alone. Victor Hale's body lay on the floor. His eyes were open, staring at the ceiling. The wound on his chest had been cleanly and decisively cut open. Professional work. The killer knew what they were doing. But Holmes's attention was drawn more to the room itself than to the body. The room was large, perhaps 40 square meters. A fireplace, 2 armchairs, a desk, and paintings on the walls. Everything looked normal, but something was missing. Holmes slowly walked around the room. His eyes scanned every corner, every detail. Then he stopped. On the opposite wall above the fireplace hung a large mirror. It had an antique frame gilded in gold, probably dating back to the 18th century. The mirror was clean, very clean. Holmes approached the mirror and touched its surface with his finger. The glass was warm from the fireplace's heat, but along the edges there was a faint trace of moisture. Someone had recently wiped this mirror, repeatedly wiped it. "Lestrade," Holmes said aloud, "close the curtains and light a single candle." Lestrade hesitated but obeyed. The room was plunged into darkness, with only the flickering light of the candle remaining. Holmes took the candle and began moving it in front of the mirror. As the angle of the light changed, something appeared on the mirror's surface. At first it was indistinct, just faint shadows. But when Holmes found the right angle, words emerged. Faint, almost invisible, but it was there. A single word. Witness. Watson recoiled. "Goodness, what is this?" Holmes lowered the candle and looked thoughtfully at the mirror. "Our killer likes to leave messages, and this message is connected to the word confession in the Drayton case. But how did he write this? Writing on glass isn't easy." "Finger oil," said Holmes. "Someone wrote on this mirror with their finger, then they wiped it off, but the oil on the glass doesn't wipe off completely. When the light hits it at the right angle, the old writing reappears. Our killer knows this. He left this message deliberately." Lestrade swallowed. "What does that mean?" "Witness." Holmes turned and looked at Lestrade. There was a dark gleam in his eyes. "Victor Hale was also a witness, Lestrade, like Drayton, 20 years ago, in the same case." In the afternoon, Holmes and Watson went down to Scotland Yard's archives. Among the dusty files from 20 years ago, they found the Mercer, Holloway, and Crane case. The file was thick and yellowed. As Holmes flipped through the pages one by one, Watson took notes. 1869. East London, Holmes read aloud. A merchant, Edward Blackstone, was murdered in his home by burglars. 3 suspects were arrested. Arthur Mercer, 32 years old, factory worker. James Holloway, 28 years old, dock worker. Peter Crane, 35 years old, blacksmith. What was the evidence? Holmes turned the page. Interesting. Physical evidence is scarce. The murder weapon was never found. No fingerprints. But there are witness statements. 4 witnesses. Watson leaned forward. 4? Yes. All 4 claimed to have seen the suspects near the scene of the crime on the night of the robbery. Their statements were decisive in court. The jury found the 3 men guilty based on the witnesses' statements. And they were executed. 3 weeks later, the appeal was denied. Holmes closed the file and took a deep breath. Then he pulled out the page where he had written the witnesses' names. "Here are our witnesses," he said. "Samuel Drayton, notary; Victor Hale, merchant; Iris Whitmore, music teacher; and Thomas Kerr, court clerk." Watson looked at the list. 2 are dead, 2 are alive. For now. Silence fell. Watson recognized the expression on his friend's face. This was the moment when the pieces of a puzzle began to fall into place. "Holmes," Watson said slowly, "these men, did they really lie? Were the innocent hanged?" Holmes thought for a long time before answering. Then he pulled out a few pages from the file and handed them to Watson. "Put the witness statements side by side and read them." Watson took the papers and began to read. The first statement was from Samuel Drayton. "Around 9 o'clock, I saw 3 men near the scene. One was tall, one wore a hat, and one limped." The second statement was from Victor Hale. "Around 9 o'clock, I noticed 3 suspicious men on the street. One was tall, one wore a hat, and one was limping." Watson frowned. "The same words. Go on." The third statement was from Iris Whitmore. "Around 9 o'clock, I saw 3 men from my window. One was taller than the others. One was wearing a hat, and one was limping." Fourth statement, Thomas Kerr. At 9 o'clock, I saw 3 people on the corner of the street. The tall one, the one wearing a hat, and the one limping. Watson put the papers down. His face had gone pale. This can't be a coincidence. 4 different people used the same words in the same order. Because these statements were written, Holmes said in a cold voice. Someone dictated to these 4 people what to say. The witnesses didn't tell the truth. They repeated a memorized lie. But why? Who would do such a thing? Holmes stood up and walked to the window. Outside, officers were rushing around in the Scotland Yard courtyard. I don't know yet, he said, but someone does. Someone has uncovered this lie that led to the deaths of 3 innocent men 20 years ago, and now they're tracking down the witnesses one by one. Revenge. Justice, at least in the killer's eyes. Holmes turned. This isn't a series of murders, Watson. This is a delayed case. Our killer sees himself as judge, jury, and executioner. That evening, Holmes presented Lestrade with a report on Leonard Vance. Vance is innocent, Holmes said without hesitation. Lestrade frowned. How can you be so sure? Because this murder is the work of the same killer as Drayton's, and that killer is targeting the witnesses from the case 20 years ago. Vance has no connection to that case. He's just a moneylender. A poor man who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. So should I release him? Do you have any other choice? Lestrade grumbled. But that same night, Vance was released. As the man walked out of the station, he saw Holmes. There was no gratitude in his eyes, only anger and fear. You, Vance said, turning to Holmes. You know something about this. Who killed Drayton? Holmes replied calmly. When I find out, you'll find out too, Mr. Vance. But for now, stay away from London. You're not safe in this city. Vance wanted to say something, but Holmes had already turned away. By the time they returned to Baker Street, it was past midnight. Watson was exhausted, but there was no sign of fatigue in Holmes's eyes. The man was still thinking, still calculating. There are 2 more witnesses, said Holmes, sitting down in front of the fireplace. Iris Whitmore and Thomas Kerr. Our killer will find them too. What will we do? Can't we tell the police and have them placed under protection? Holmes shook his head. Protection won't be enough. Our killer is patient and clever. He must have been watching Drayton for weeks. Hale too. These murders weren't spontaneous, they were planned. He'll find a way around the protection. Then what? We need to find the killer. We can't protect the victims without finding him. Watson stared thoughtfully into the fire. 3 men executed 20 years ago. Mercer, Holloway, and Crane. Is it possible to find their families? Holmes smiled slightly. A clever question, Watson. Yes, it is possible. And that's exactly what we'll do tomorrow morning. Are you suspecting their families? I don't suspect them, I know it. These murders aren't ordinary revenge. They're personal, deep, the product of 20 years of pain. Whoever did this has a close connection to those who were executed. Holmes stood up and walked over to the map on the wall. He placed 3 marks on London: Drayton's house, Hale's house, and Scotland Yard, where the archives were located. 3 executions, Holmes said, looking at the map. 3 families, mothers, fathers, spouses, children. Someone has carried this pain for 20 years, waited, planned, and now acted. Why now? Why after 20 years? Holmes turned and looked at Watson. Because something changed. Perhaps they gained new information. Perhaps an opportunity arose. Or perhaps they simply lost patience. The fire crackled in the fireplace. Shadows danced on the walls. "Tomorrow," said Holmes, "we begin investigating the Mercer family. Arthur Mercer had a wife, Rose Mercer, and a son, Daniel." Watson jotted down the names. Daniel Mercer. How old was he when his father was hanged? Holmes thought. According to the case file, Arthur Mercer's wife Rose was admitted to a mental hospital shortly after her husband's execution. His son Daniel. The file doesn't mention his age, but it says he was a child, probably around 10 or 12. So he's in his 30s now. Yes, and if I'm correct, a man who couldn't prove his father's innocence, lost his mother, and lived with that pain for 20 years. Watson shuddered. "Goodness, this is a tragedy." "Yes," Holmes said quietly. "But tragedy does not justify murder. Daniel Mercer, if he is the killer, will face the law, just like his father." But as he spoke these words, there was none of Holmes's usual certainty in his voice. Watson noticed this, but made no comment. Some cases couldn't be solved by logic alone. Some cases touched the heart as well. That night, in another corner of London, a man sat in a dark room. Before him was a list. 4 names. 2 were crossed out: Samuel Drayton, Victor Hale. 2 names remained: Iris Whitmore, Thomas Kerr. The man looked at the list. There was no anger or pain on his face, only cold determination. There was a mirror on the table, a small hand mirror. The man looked into the mirror and saw his own reflection. "Soon, father," he whispered. "Soon they will all pay." Then he blew out the candle, and the dark room swallowed him. Outside, the moon was filtering through the clouds above London's rooftops, and somewhere a clock was ticking away the time of delayed justice. Chapter 3. Empty Cage. 3 more days passed. Holmes spent these 3 days investigating the Mercer family. Arthur Mercer's past, his wife Rose's records at the mental hospital, tracking down his son Daniel. Each piece of information shed light on a corner of the puzzle, but the whole picture was still unclear. Rose Mercer had died 6 months after her husband's execution. Official records stated heart failure, but Holmes knew this didn't tell the whole story. The woman had believed in her husband's innocence, and that belief had destroyed her. According to the mental hospital notes, in her final days she had repeatedly uttered the same phrase. They lied. They all lied. Finding information about Daniel Mercer was more difficult. After his mother's death, the child had been sent to an orphanage, Southwark Orphanage. When Holmes went there, he learned that the orphanage had closed 20 years ago. The records had been scattered, some burned, some lost. But Holmes didn't give up. He found former employees, questioned witnesses, and finally caught a clue. Daniel Mercer had left the orphanage at 16 and apprenticed himself to a watchmaker, a workshop in Clerkenwell. When Holmes went there, the workshop owner had long since died, but neighbours remembered Daniel. "He was a quiet boy," said an elderly woman. "He never smiled, but his hands were very skilled. He repaired watches, boxes, all kinds of mechanisms. His master loved him very much." "Where is he now?" The woman shrugged. "Who knows? He left years ago. He said he was going to open his own workshop, but I don't know where he went." Holmes noted this information. Daniel Mercer was a watchmaker. He worked with mechanisms. The altered mechanism in the clock at Drayton's house. This couldn't be a coincidence. but there was no concrete evidence. Not yet. On the evening of the third day, news arrived. Another murder. This time the victim was Iris Whitmore, 63 years old, a retired music teacher. She had been strangled to death in a locked room in her small house in Kensington. Holmes's expression didn't change when he heard the news. Watson was used to his friend's coolness by now, but he still felt a sense of unease. "We're too late," Watson said quietly. "No," said Holmes, putting on his coat. "We're not too late. The killer is one step ahead of us, but that will change. Every murder gives us new clues, and this time something will be different. I can feel it." Watson didn't object to these prophetic words. He had learned to trust Holmes's instincts. Iris Whitmore's house was a small, ivy-covered building on a quiet street in Kensington. Police cars were parked in front of the house, and curious neighbours were watching from their windows. Lestrade greeted them at the door. His face was pale. "This time it's different," Lestrade said as they entered. "Very different." Holmes and Watson followed him. A narrow corridor, a small sitting room, and, finally, the music room. The door had been broken down. It had been locked from the inside, but the police had forced it open. Holmes examined the door's locking mechanism. The bolt, the hinges, the wooden frame. Everything was intact. This door had been locked from the inside, and it was impossible to open it from the outside. "The windows?" Holmes asked. "All closed and bolted from the inside," said Lestrade. "We checked. There's no point of entry." Holmes nodded and entered the room. Iris Whitmore's body lay on the floor in the middle of the room. The old woman looked almost peaceful in her white nightgown. But the bruises on her neck told the story of her final moments. She had been strangled, not by hand, but by something. Holmes approached the body and examined the marks on her neck. Fine, even lines. Not a rope or wire, something softer, perhaps fabric, perhaps ribbon. Then he began scanning the room. The room was small, perhaps 15 square meters. The walls were covered with soundproof panels. There was a piano in the corner sitting silently with its lid closed. A few chairs, a music stand, and old photographs hanging on the wall. But something else caught Holmes's attention. In the exact center of the room, hanging from the ceiling, was a hook, and on that hook, an empty birdcage swayed. The cage was antique. Brass wires, decorative embellishments, a small door. But it was empty inside. No bird, just emptiness. Holmes approached the cage and examined it carefully. The cage was clean, no dust. It had been hung here recently. Not the victim's doing, but the killer's. "What's this cage doing here?" Lestrade asked from behind. Holmes did not answer. Instead, he began to test the room's acoustics. He clapped his hands. The sound echoed. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound did not bounce off the walls. It seemed to circle inside the room. "This room is an echo chamber," Holmes said finally. The soundproofing panels, the angle of the walls, the height of the ceiling. Everything is designed to keep the sound inside and make it echo repeatedly. Watson looked around. That makes sense for a music room, so the teacher can hear the students playing clearly. Yes, but our killer used this feature for another purpose. Holmes walked to the windows and opened the curtains. Sunlight flooded the room. Then he looked at the photographs on the walls. Former students, concerts, graduation ceremonies. And one photograph caught his attention. The photo showed a young Iris Whitmore. 3 men stood beside her. Below it was a date, 1869. Holmes took the photograph from the wall and examined it closely. 3 men. They weren't familiar faces, but their posture and clothing reflected the style of that era. "This photograph," said Holmes, "was taken 20 years ago, probably before the case. Witnesses in the case? Perhaps, or someone else. But what matters is how deeply Iris Whitmore's past is intertwined with this case." Holmes put the photograph in his pocket and returned to the cage. He picked up the cage and sniffed it. There was a faint scent. Lavender and something else. A metallic smell. "Blood," said Holmes. "There was a bird in this cage, but it was killed. And then the cage was cleaned." Watson looked at the cage in horror. "Did the killer kill the victim's bird?" "Yes, and then hung the empty cage here, as a symbol." "What symbol?" Holmes hung the cage back in place and took a step back. The empty cage cast a shadow in the sunlight. The shadow of the bars seemed to envelop the body on the floor inside the cage. "Imprisonment," Holmes said quietly. "This cage symbolizes imprisonment. Our killer doesn't just kill his victims, he punishes them symbolically. He made Drayton listen to time, with a clock. He forced Hale to confront himself, with a mirror. And Whitmore, he killed Whitmore in prison, in his own room, his own music room, locked and inescapable." Lestrade shuddered. "This man is mad." "No," said Holmes. "He's not mad. He's very clever, and he's suffered greatly. These murders aren't random. Each one is a message. Our killer is making the witnesses pay for what they did 20 years ago. Drayton lost his time. Hale saw the truth in the mirror. And Whitmore was locked in a cage, just like the innocent are locked in prison." Before leaving the scene, Holmes noticed something else. Next to the piano, on the floor, was a small piece of paper, folded, almost invisible. Holmes picked up the paper and unfolded it. There were a few handwritten words on it. They screamed, but no one heard. "Now you scream. Who will hear?" Holmes showed the paper to Watson. "The killer's message," Watson said, his voice trembling. This man tortures his victims. Not physically, psychologically. He confronts them with the truth in their final moments. And then he silences their voices." Holmes carefully put the paper in his pocket. It was the killer's handwriting. The first concrete evidence. He could analyze it. That night, it hit the London newspapers like a bomb. "Ghost killer shakes London." 3 murders, 3 different methods, no concrete suspects. Journalists pounced on the story, and new theories and speculations appeared in every column. Some described the killer as a ghost. Others claimed it was the work of a secret organization. Waves of panic began to spread. A young reporter named Edwin Marsh wrote a special article for the Daily Telegraph. The headline was striking: "Invisible Justice or Terror." Marsh had discovered that all 3 victims had testified in the same case 20 years earlier. How he found this information was unclear, but it shook the public. People began to ask questions. Who were these witnesses? Why had they been targeted? And what had happened 20 years earlier? Holmes frowned as he read the newspaper. "This Marsh is dangerous," he said to Watson. "He knows too much. Maybe he leaked it from the police. Maybe. Or he did his own research. Either way, the spread of this information will make our job harder. The killer now knows he's being tracked." "Won't that stop him?" Holmes shook his head. "No. Nothing can stop a killer like this. He believes he's part of a mission. He thinks he's dispensing justice. Newspaper headlines won't slow him down. They might even speed him up. Watson placed the newspaper on the table. So, what will we do? Holmes sat down opposite the fireplace and pressed his fingertips together. A thinking pose. Watson knew this look well. "One name remains," Holmes said slowly. "Thomas Kerr, retired court clerk. If I'm right, the killer will find him too, but this time we'll be ready." "Will we put him under protection?" "Better than that. We'll use him as bait." Watson's eyes widened. "Holmes, this is very dangerous. The man is under threat of death." "I know, but we have no other choice. We need to lure him out to catch the killer. And Kerr has been waiting for death for 20 years. Maybe he's ready to face it now." These words troubled Watson, but he couldn't object. Holmes was right. Sometimes, to catch justice, you had to walk into the darkness. The next morning, Holmes and Watson visited Thomas Kerr. Kerr lived in a small house in Greenwich. He was over 70, hunched over, trembling. When he opened the door, there was no fear in his eyes, only weariness. "I was expecting you," Kerr said, ushering them inside. "I read the papers. Drayton, Hale, Whitmore. They're all dead, and I'm next." Holmes looked at the man carefully. "How do you know that?" Kerr laughed bitterly. "Because I've been waiting for this for 20 years, Mr. Holmes. Every night when I go to bed, I think this might be my last night. And every morning when I wake up, I feel like I've won another day. But now, I'm tired. Tired of this waiting. Tired of this fear." Watson handed the man a glass of water. Kerr took the glass with trembling hands. "Tell us what happened," said Holmes. 20 years ago. The Mercer case. What really happened?" Kerr's eyes looked off into the distance. 20 years of memories. 20 years of guilt. "We lied," he finally said. "All of us. Drayton, Hale, Whitmore, and me. We never saw those three men, Mercer, Holloway, and Crane. But someone taught us what to say, and we said it." "Who taught us?" Kerr shook his head. "I don't know. I really don't know. Just a man came. He offered money. A lot of money. And we were poor. Desperate. We took the money and lied in court. You caused the deaths of 3 innocent men." Tears streamed from Kerr's eyes. "Yes. And every night since that day, I see their faces. Being hanged, taking their last breaths. Every night for 20 years. Silence fell. Holmes's face showed no expression, but Watson could sense something boiling inside his friend. "Now I'll make you an offer," Holmes said in a cold voice. "I can protect you. We can catch him before the killer finds you. But I need your help." Kerr raised his head. "What do you want me to do?" "You won't hide anything. You'll tell me everything. And if the killer comes, we'll be ready." Kerr thought for a long time. Then he slowly nodded. "All right," he said. "There's no point in running anymore. Maybe this is the only way to pay for my sins." Holmes stood up and walked to the window. Outside, Greenwich's quiet streets stretched out under the sun. But Holmes's eyes were searching for something else. A shadow, a movement, a sign. Was the killer nearby? Was he watching? Holmes didn't know, but he knew one thing. This game would soon come to an end. And the winner would be the most patient one. That night on Baker Street, Holmes sat by the fireplace, deep in thought. Watson sat across from him, waiting with a glass of brandy. 3 murders, Holmes said slowly. 3 witnesses, and a killer. Daniel Mercer. Probably, but there's no evidence, just a guess. Watson lowered his glass. Are you really going to use Kerr as bait? Holmes did not answer. His eyes were fixed on the fire, but his thoughts were elsewhere, on a case from 20 years ago, on 3 innocent men, and on the wounds they left behind. This case, Holmes said finally, is one of the most tragic cases I've ever seen. The victims and the killer are both products of the same pain, and in the end, no one will win. The fire crackled in the fireplace, shadows danced on the walls, and somewhere in the darkness of London, a man was planning his 4th victim. An empty cage was before his eyes, and the silence screamed at the highest pitch. After leaving Thomas Kerr's house, Holmes made an unexpected offer to Watson. "We're going to Newgate," Holmes said as he hailed a carriage. Watson frowned. "The prison? Why?" "Because the answers are there. The execution records from 20 years ago, the prisoner files, the final statements. Everything is stored there. And I want to read Arthur Mercer's last words." Watson did not object. He followed Holmes to the dark gates of Newgate Prison. Newgate was London's oldest and most gloomy prison. For centuries, criminals had been tried, imprisoned, and executed here. Its walls had absorbed the screams of thousands of prisoners. Even now, in broad daylight, a gloomy atmosphere hung around the building. The prison warden knew Holmes' reputation and granted them access to the archive room. This room in the basement was filled with dusty shelves. On each shelf, hundreds of years of records, files, and documents were piled up. Holmes spent hours searching for the 1869 records. Watson helped him. Finally, they found what they were looking for: the complete file on the Mercer, Holloway, and Crane case. The file consisted of 3 parts: court transcripts, witness statements, and execution records. Holmes read the court transcripts first. The case began with the murder of a wealthy merchant named Edward Blackstone. Blackstone had been stabbed to death in his home, and his safe had been robbed. The police had arrested 3 suspects: Arthur Mercer, James Holloway, and Peter Crane. All 3 were labourers living in poor neighbourhoods in East London. "Look at the evidence," Holmes said, handing Watson a few pages. "What do you see?" Watson examined the pages. "Not much. The murder weapon was never found. The stolen money was never recovered. There are no fingerprints, no physical evidence other than witness testimony." "Yes, Arthur Mercer, James Holloway, and Peter Crane. All 3 were innocent, but the statements of 4 false witnesses were enough to convince the jury, and the judge handed down the death sentence." In the gloomy silence of the archive room, these words echoed. Watson had heard many painful stories throughout his career, but this was different. This was a story where the system itself had become a murder weapon. Holmes turned to the execution records. 3 separate files: Mercer, Holloway, and Crane. Each file contained notes about the prisoners' final days: their last meals, their last visitors, their last words. Arthur Mercer's file was the thickest. The man had written a letter the night before his execution. The letter was inside the file, in a yellowed envelope. Holmes opened the envelope and took out the letter. The handwriting was shaky but legible. "To my son Daniel. When I write this letter, I will be dead in a few hours. You know I am innocent. God knows it. But people don't know, or they don't want to know. I need to tell you something. Don't seek revenge. That poison will rot you from the inside. I am innocent, but I don't want to die in anger. I want to die in peace. and I want you to live in peace too. Your mother loves you. So do I. Be strong, my son. And remember, true justice comes not from man, but from God, your father, Arthur Mercer. When Holmes finished the letter, he paused for a moment. Then he carefully placed the letter back into the envelope. Watson tried to read his friend's face, but Holmes's expression was masked. "What are you thinking?" Watson asked. Holmes waited a long time before answering. Then he spoke slowly. Arthur Mercer told his son not to seek revenge, but Daniel didn't listen to his father, or couldn't listen. For 20 years, this letter, these final words must have echoed in his mind. And finally, the anger won out. Can you blame him? Holmes looked at Watson. There was a complex expression in his eyes. Blame him? No. Understand him? Yes. But understanding is not forgiving. Daniel Mercer could have fought for his father's innocence. He could have gone to court, written to newspapers, searched for evidence. Instead, he committed murder. And murder, whatever the reason, is murder. Watson nodded, but a voice inside him whispered that the situation wasn't that simple. Holmes examined the other two files, James Holloway and Peter Crane. There was an interesting detail in Holloway's file. The man had received a visitor before his execution, his wife, Margaret Holloway. She was with him in his final moments, and according to the records, she had wept uncontrollably. Margaret Holloway, Holmes said, noting the name. I wonder where she is now. Crane's file was shorter. The man was single, had no family. His last words had been recorded. God is my witness. I did not kill that man. Holmes closed the files and stood up. The dusty air of the archive room was beginning to feel suffocating. Enough, he said. Now I know what happened, but I need to prove who did it. Watson also stood up. Daniel Mercer. Probably, but there's another possibility. Margaret Holloway, or their children, relatives. 20 years is a long time. A lot could have changed. Where do we start? Holmes answered as he walked toward the door. Birth and death records. I need to find Daniel Mercer's current address. And what happened to Margaret Holloway? The next 3 days were a research marathon for Holmes. Watson had rarely seen his friend work so intensely. Holmes combed through birth records at Somerset House, examined church registers, and researched old neighbourhood records. The information came in bits and pieces, but each piece made the picture a little clearer. Daniel Mercer, born in 1857. He was 12 when his father was executed. His mother, Rose Mercer, died in a mental hospital in 1870. Daniel was sent to Southwark Orphanage and left as an apprentice at 16. The trail goes cold for the next 15 years. But in 1885, a name emerges. Daniel Mercer opened a watchmaker's workshop in Clerkenwell. Holmes went to Clerkenwell to verify this information. The workshop was still there, but it was now in someone else's hands. Mercer, said the new owner, an elderly man. Yes, I remember him. He sold the workshop about 5 years ago. I don't know where he went. He was quiet. Very quiet. But he was good at his work. He made clocks, music boxes, all kinds of mechanisms. Music boxes? Yes, he took special orders. For wealthy clients, very complex mechanisms, sound recording systems, and so on. I couldn't go that far, but Mercer, he was a genius. Holmes engraved this information in his mind. Daniel Mercer wasn't just a watchmaker. He was a mechanism expert. He could build sound recording systems. The clock in Drayton's house, the acoustic arrangement in Whitmore's room. Everything was starting to make sense. There was less information about Margaret Holloway. The woman had left London 2 years after her husband's execution and disappeared without a trace. Maybe she was dead. Maybe she had moved to another city. Holmes couldn't find her. But that didn't matter, because all the clues pointed to Daniel Mercer. On the evening of the 4th day, Holmes presented all his findings to Watson. In the sitting room on Baker Street, the wall had become a crime map. Photographs, names, arrows, and notes were all connected. "Let me summarize," said Holmes, standing in front of the map. 20 years ago, a merchant named Edward Blackstone was murdered. The real killer was never found. But someone arranged for 4 witnesses to frame 3 innocent men. These witnesses lied in court, and Arthur Mercer, James Holloway, and Peter Crane were executed. Watson nodded. "We know that much." Now, 20 years later, someone is killing these witnesses one by one. Drayton, Hale, Whitmore, and next is Kerr. The killer uses symbolic tools in each murder: a clock, a mirror, a birdcage. These symbols represent the witnesses' crimes. And the killer is Daniel Mercer. Most likely, yes, Arthur Mercer's son. He was 12 when his father was executed. His mother died shortly after. Daniel grew up in an orphanage and became a watchmaker. He learned to work with mechanisms, sound recording systems, and for 20 years, he planned. Holmes looked at the map on the wall. All the lines, all the arrows pointed to a single point: Daniel Mercer. "But there's a problem," said Holmes. "There's no evidence, no concrete, court-admissible evidence, no handwriting sample, no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses. Just logical deduction." Watson frowned. "So what do we do?" Holmes turned and looked at Watson. There was a dangerous gleam in his eyes. "Kerr, Thomas Kerr. He's our only chance. The killer will target him, and we'll be there. Are you going to use him as bait?" "Kerr has already agreed. The man has lived with guilt for 20 years. Perhaps this is his chance to atone." Watson shifted uneasily. "This is very dangerous, Holmes. What if something goes wrong?" Holmes walked to the window and looked out at London's nightscape. Street lamps flickered, shadows danced. "Anything could go wrong," Holmes said quietly. "But if we do nothing, Kerr will die, and the killer will disappear. I can't risk that." A long silence followed. Then Watson stood up and came over to his friend. "I'm with you," Watson said. "As always." Holmes smiled slightly. For the first time that night, a genuine smile. "I know, Watson, I know." That night, Holmes wrote a letter. The letter was addressed to Thomas Kerr. "Mr. Kerr, I will be at your home tomorrow night. All you need to do is continue your normal routine. Turn off the lights at the usual time, lock the doors, and go to bed. Leave the rest to me. If everything goes as planned, the killer will be caught. And you may finally find the peace you've been waiting for 20 years. Sherlock Holmes." As he sealed the letter, Holmes looked outside. It had started to rain. London's rooftops glistened with silver droplets. Somewhere Daniel Mercer was also making plans for his final victim. But this time, the hunter would become the hunted. The next morning, Watson asked Holmes a question over breakfast. "What has affected you most in this case?" Holmes set down his cup and thought. Then he spoke slowly. "The concept of justice. Everyone in this case is seeking justice. The witnesses sold justice for money 20 years ago. Daniel Mercer is trying to enforce his own justice. The police represent legal justice, and you." Holmes looked at Watson. I am seeking the truth. Not justice, but the truth. Because without the truth, justice is impossible. And in this case, the truth has been buried for 20 years. 3 innocent men died because no one sought the truth. No one asked questions. No one suspected anything. Watson listened in silence. "This was no mistake," said Holmes, his voice hardening. "This was a deliberate murder of justice. Someone decided to send 3 innocent men to their deaths. They fixed the witnesses, deceived the court, and murdered justice. And now Daniel Mercer is doing the same thing. He's creating his own justice. He's setting up his own court." Holmes stood up and looked at the mirror above the fireplace. He saw his reflection, tired eyes, a lined face, grey in hair. "Tonight," said Holmes, "we will break this cycle. We will catch Daniel Mercer, but Watson, know this. Even when we catch him, true justice will not be served. Arthur Mercer, James Holloway, and Peter Crane will still be dead, and nothing will bring them back." The fire crackled in the fireplace. The rain had stopped outside, but the sky remained overcast. And in a corner of London, a man was making his final preparations for the final witness, for the final justice. Chapter 5. The Killer's Logic. In the small house in Greenwich, Thomas Kerr was waiting for night to fall. Holmes's letter was in his hand. He had read the words over and over. "Continue your normal routine. Leave the rest to me." Simple instructions, but Kerr's hands were trembling. In his 70 years of life, he had seen many things. He had testified in hundreds of court cases. He had seen the faces of criminals, the tears of victims, the cold expressions of judges. He had seen it all, but nothing compared to the fear he felt that night. Because this time, he was the defendant. He looked out the window. The street was empty. Evening darkness had fallen, and the street lights hadn't come on yet. Shadows stretched between the houses. Was the killer there? Was he watching? Kerr pulled the curtain aside and turned back inside. The fire was burning in the fireplace, but there was a chill in the air of the room, the kind that seeps into your bones. "God," Kerr whispered, "what have I done? What have we done?" The answer came from 20 years ago, silent, ruthless, unforgiving. At the same time, Holmes and Watson were making their final preparations on Baker Street. Holmes had spread a map of London on the table. Greenwich was marked in the southeast corner of the map, on the banks of the Thames. Kerr's house was indicated by a small red dot. "The plan is this," said Holmes, pointing at the map. "You will position yourself behind Kerr's house. You will watch the garden gate. I will be at the front. Lestrade and his men will wait at both ends of the street." Watson frowned. "Does Lestrade know?" "He's been informed, but—" Holmes paused. "But he doesn't fully approve of the plan." "What do you mean he doesn't approve?" Holmes sighed. "Lestrade thinks it's a trap. He says we're putting Kerr in danger. He claims that instead of provoking the killer, we might scare him away. Maybe he's right. Maybe, but we have no other choice. Daniel Mercer, if he really is. The killer will act soon. The newspapers have splashed the story across their front pages. Public pressure is mounting. Mercer will rush to complete his plan, and Kerr is his final target." Watson checked his gun. It was loaded, the barrel clean. "What if Mercer doesn't come tonight?" "He will," Holmes said firmly. "I know it. I feel it." Watson did not question his friend's certainty. Holmes's instincts rarely failed him. At 9 o'clock that night, Holmes and Watson arrived in Greenwich. Kerr's house stood at the end of the street, slightly apart from the other houses. It was a 2-story brick building. There were a few bushes in the front yard and a small shed in the back. The windows were closed and the curtains drawn. Holmes examined the house carefully. Entry points, escape routes, shadowy corners. He committed everything to memory. "How will the killer get in here?" Watson asked. Holmes thought. "Not through the front door, too obvious. The back door makes more sense. Or the window. The bedroom window on the second floor." Watson looked up. The window was closed, but the latch was nowhere to be seen. "How will he get there?" "The vines," said Holmes, pointing to the side wall of the house. "They're strong enough. A man could climb them." Watson smiled, but there was no joy in his smile. "You're starting to think like a murderer. To catch him, I need to understand him. And to understand him, I need to think like him." As the clock struck 10, Holmes took his position. He stood in the shadow of an abandoned house across the street. From here, he could see the front of Kerr's house. Watson was at the back, watching the garden gate. Lestrade and 2 officers waited at either end of the street. The trap was set. Now, all that was left was to wait. Holmes waited. The minutes dragged on like hours. The night was cold, cutting to the bone. But Holmes didn't move. His eyes were fixed on Kerr's house. As he waited, he thought about Daniel Mercer. He tried to understand this man's mind. Mercer had lost his father at the age of 12. He had been hanged. For a child, this was an unimaginable trauma. Then his mother. Rose Mercer had collapsed after her husband's death. She had died in a mental hospital, alone and forgotten. Daniel had grown up in an orphanage, alone, angry, wounded. A child no one loved, no one wanted. But smart. Very smart. He had learned to use his hands, clocks, mechanisms, complex systems, and he had planned for 20 years. Holmes couldn't help but admire Mercer's patience. 20 years. To wait that long, to plan, to prepare. An ordinary person couldn't do that. Mercer wasn't ordinary. He was a man on a mission. But no matter how just the mission was murder. And Holmes's duty was to ensure justice. True justice. The justice of the law. As the clock struck 11, there was a movement. Holmes's eyes sharpened. At the end of the street, a figure appeared among the shadows. The man was walking, slowly and carefully. Black coat, black hat. His face was hidden. Holmes held his breath. Was it him? Daniel Mercer? The figure approached Kerr's house. He stopped in front of the front door and looked around. Then he passed by. He passed the house and continued walking towards the end of the street. Holmes relaxed but remained alert. Perhaps he was scouting. Perhaps he was surveying the area. Killers often stalked their targets for days. But the figure didn't return. It vanished into the night. Another hour passed. Nothing happened. Watson signaled from his position. The back was quiet. Lestrade was silent. London was asleep. And the killer was not coming. When the clock struck midnight, Lestrade began to grow impatient. He quietly approached Holmes. There was a look of irritation on his face. "This isn't working," Lestrade whispered. "The man isn't coming. Maybe he saw us. Maybe he figured out the trap." Holmes shook his head. "No, not yet. Be patient." "Patience? Holmes, my men are freezing. Are you waiting for Kerr to have a heart attack inside?" "The killer doesn't rush," Holmes said calmly. "We know that. He watched Drayton for weeks. Hale too. Whitmore as well. This man is patient, very patient. So must we be." Lestrade grumbled. but stepped back. Holmes began waiting again, but his mind was elsewhere. The killer's logic, the killer's pattern. Something was missing. Something was being overlooked. Drayton, the clock, a symbol of time. The victim had talked for hours before dying. The killer had listened. Hale, the mirror, a symbol of confrontation. The victim had confronted his own reflection, his own lie. Whitmore, the birdcage, a symbol of imprisonment. The victim had died in a locked room, with no escape. And Kerr. What symbol for Kerr, Holmes thought? Drayton was a notary. Time was important to him because of documents, contracts, dates. Hale was a merchant. The mirror was meaningful to him because of image, reputation, appearance. Whitmore was a music teacher. The cage was fitting for him because of sound, melody, trapped notes. But Kerr was a court clerk. The man who kept the records, wrote the words, documented the statements. What could his symbol be? Holmes's eyes suddenly lit up. "Watson," he whispered, calling his friend over. Watson rushed over. "What's wrong?" "The symbol," Holmes said excitedly. "Kerr's symbol. Think, Watson. A watch for Drayton, a mirror for Hale, a cage for Whitmore. What for Kerr?" Watson thought. Kerr was a court clerk. He kept records. Maybe a pen? A notebook? No, think deeper. The killer doesn't use ordinary symbols. Each symbol is directly linked to the victim's crime. Drayton sold time. He died by the symbol of time. Hale protected his image. He died by the mirror. Whitmore used his voice. He was condemned to silence. Watson's eyes widened. Kerr wrote words. He recorded false statements. Yes. And those false words led to the deaths of 3 innocent men. Kerr's symbol must be related to words, but not just words. Recorded words. Eternal words. Holmes paused for a moment. Then he understood. "The music box," he said breathlessly. "The killer will use a music box, a mechanical one that records and repeats sounds, just like Kerr repeating false statements for 20 years. Watson looked at him in horror. "How do you know?" "Because it makes sense. Daniel Mercer was a clockmaker. He made music boxes, complex mechanisms, sound recording systems. The clock in Drayton's house had a sound cylinder inside it. He'll use the same technology for Kerr." Holmes jumped to his feet. "Lestrade! Lestrade!" The inspector ran over. "What is it?" "We need to change the plan. The killer won't be coming tonight. He's not ready yet, but he'll be coming soon. And when he does, he'll be carrying a music box." Lestrade frowned. "A music box? What nonsense is this?" "It's not nonsense, Lestrade. It's logic. The killer's logic. There's a symbol in every murder. Kerr's symbol will be a music box. If we understand that, we can catch him." Lestrade looked skeptical. "Holmes, this is just a theory. There's no concrete evidence." "Theories are the mother of evidence," Holmes said impatiently. "What you need to do now is find Daniel Mercer's workshop. The man sold his workshop in Clerkenwell 5 years ago. Where is he working now? Does he have a new workshop? Find it." Lestrade hesitated. "Now? In the middle of the night?" "Yes, now. Every minute counts." But Lestrade didn't move. A skeptical expression was on his face. "Holmes," he said slowly, "this is just your guess. Maybe Mercer isn't the killer. Maybe it's someone else. Maybe nothing will happen. I can't send my men out on a hunch." Holmes's face hardened. "Then I'll send them." He turned and looked at Watson. "Are you with me?" Watson didn't hesitate. "Always." The two of them walked into the darkness together. Lestrade watched them go but did not move. Sometimes justice had to walk alone. The next few days were a period of intense investigation for Holmes. He tracked Daniel Mercer's trail. Starting in Clerkenwell, he combed every corner of London. He questioned watchmakers, mechanics, antique dealers. Had anyone heard Mercer's name, seen him, worked with him? The answers came slowly. Mercer had disappeared 5 years ago after selling his workshop in Clerkenwell. But not completely. Some customers were still in contact with him. For special orders, complex mechanisms, sound recording devices, music boxes. An antique dealer gave Holmes an interesting piece of information. Mercer. Yes, I know him. He ordered a music box a few months ago. He wanted an antique case, 18th century style. He paid a lot of money. Where did you deliver the box? The antique dealer thought. He gave an address. Wait, Southwark. Yes, a warehouse in Southwark. Bermondsey Street, I think. Holmes noted down the address. Southwark, the south bank of the river. Factories, warehouses, abandoned buildings. A perfect place to hide. That night, Holmes went to Southwark alone. He had wanted to take Watson, but his friend had caught a fever. Waiting out a night in the rain had given him a cold. Holmes left him at Baker Street and set off alone. Bermondsey Street was one of Southwark's darkest corners. Old factory buildings, abandoned warehouses, broken windows and rusted doors. At midnight, the street was completely deserted. Holmes found the address given by the antique dealer, a 3-story brick warehouse. The windows were boarded up, but a faint light was seeping through one of them. Someone was inside. Holmes approached the door. The lock was rusty, but there were fresh oil marks on it. Someone used this door regularly. He took his monkey wrench from his pocket and unlocked the door. It creaked open. Inside was dark, but from a distance ticking sounds could be heard. Dozens of clocks, as if working together. Holmes entered and followed the sounds. The interior of the storage room had been converted into a workshop. Tables, tools, mechanical parts. There were clocks, music boxes, and sound recording devices everywhere. And on the walls? Holmes stopped and looked at the walls. Photographs. Dozens of photographs. Samuel Drayton, Victor Hale, Iris Whitmore, Thomas Kerr. And 3 more men. Arthur Mercer, James Holloway, Peter Crane. Victims and perpetrators. All together. Holmes had found Daniel Mercer's workshop. But where was Mercer? He heard a voice. Behind him. When he turned, a figure appeared in the darkness. "Mr. Holmes," the figure said in a calm voice. "I was expecting you." Chapter 6. The Voice of Truth. Holmes looked at the figure that had appeared in the darkness. The man was of medium height and slender build. He appeared to be in his early 30s, but his eyes were older. Much older. 20 years of pain had crystallized in those eyes. "Daniel Mercer," Holmes said calmly. "We finally meet face to face." Mercer stepped forward. He held a gas lamp, and its light illuminated the sharp lines of his face. He resembled his father, Arthur. The same jaw, the same nose, the same determined gaze from the old photographs. "You recognize me," Mercer said. He wasn't surprised. He was just confirming it. "I know you, and I know what you've done." Mercer smiled slightly. But there was no joy in his smile, only weariness. "Then you must know I'm not the killer." Holmes frowned. 3 people died. Drayton, Hale, Whitmore. Your hands are bloody." "No," said Mercer, shaking his head. "My hands are clean. I just listened. I listened to them. And they spoke. They were silent for 20 years, but finally they spoke. You made them confess. I made them confess, said Mercer, savouring the word. It's a beautiful word, isn't it? Confession. The truth coming out, the lies unravelling. I waited 20 years for this moment, Mr. Holmes. And now it's almost over. Holmes looked around. The workshop was a reflection of Mercer's mind. Orderly, but obsessive. Everything was in its place, but there was a darkness behind everything. The fourth target is Thomas Kerr, said Holmes. Will you kill him too? Mercer stared for a long moment before answering. Then he walked over to one of the tables and picked up an object, a small wooden box. Antique-looking, elegantly decorated, a music box. This, said Mercer, showing the box to Holmes, is for Kerr, but I won't kill him. I haven't killed any of them. Poison, knife, strangulation, aren't those your methods? A strange expression appeared on Mercer's face, a mix of pain and pride. Poison was Drayton's own choice. I told him the truth, what he did 20 years ago, who died, who suffered, and then I gave him a choice. Either go to court and confess or choose another path. He chose the other path. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Are you saying suicide? I only presented the truth. The decision was theirs. Hale was stabbed. That's not suicide. Mercer bowed his head. Hale was different. He refused to confess. He wouldn't accept the truth. He still denied causing the deaths of 3 innocent men 20 years ago. I lost control. You killed her. Yes, Mercer said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Yes, I killed her, but only her. The others made their own choices. Holmes etched this confession into his mind. Mercer was at least admitting to one murder. That was enough for the court. But there was more. Holmes could feel it. Mercer placed the music box on the table and turned to Holmes. You, Mr. Holmes, are a man who seeks the truth. I know that. Your reputation precedes you. That's why I want to show you something. He pulled a large box from under the table. Inside were dozens of cylinders, sound recording cylinders. These, said Mercer, are 20 years of lies recorded. Drayton's confession, Hale's denial, Whitmore's tears, and more. Holmes looked at the cylinders. You could have presented these as evidence in court. Why did you choose to kill? Mercer laughed bitterly. Court? Which court? The court that killed my father, Holloway, and Crane 20 years ago? Did that court deliver justice? No. That court hanged 3 innocent men based on the words of 4 lying witnesses, and no one asked. His voice rose, angry and pained. I was a child, 12 years old. I saw my father hanged. I saw my mother go mad. And for years, no one told me the truth. I didn't know my father was innocent. Not until I did my own research. Holmes listened silently. 10 years ago, Mercer continued, I found the court records. I read the witness statements, and I saw 4 statements, word for word the same. The same words, the same details, the same lies. Someone had taught these people what to say, and those lies had killed my father. So who taught them? Who arranged the witnesses? Mercer shrugged. I don't know. I still don't know. That man, whoever he was, must be long dead. But the witnesses were alive. Drayton, Hale, Whitmore, Kerr. They were still breathing, still seeing the sun, still living, while my father was 6 feet under. Mercer's eyes were wet, but no tears fell. They had dried up long ago, over 20 years. Holmes pulled up a chair and sat down. Mercer stood before him. Tell me everything, Holmes said, from beginning to end. Mercer hesitated. Then he sat down too. 10 years ago, when I found the statements, I was angry, but I didn't have a plan yet. I just wanted to know the truth. So I investigated. I found the witnesses. I followed them. I learned about their lives. And what did you see? Wealth, Mercer said, almost spitting the word. Drayton had become a respected notary. Hale, a wealthy merchant. Whitmore, a retired teacher, living comfortably. And Kerr, a retired clerk, enjoying a peaceful old age. They were all living comfortably. They were all happy. Mercer's hands clenched. While my father was rotting in his grave, they were drinking champagne. While my mother was dying in a mental hospital, they were going to the theatre. This injustice ate me up inside. And you decided to take revenge. No, Mercer said firmly, not revenge. Justice, true justice. I wanted them to stand trial, to confess, to clear my father's name. But I knew no court would do that. The evidence was too old. The witnesses would deny it. The case would be dismissed. And my father would remain guilty forever. That's why you set up your own court. Mercer nodded. Yes, I set up my own court, with my own rules. And the witnesses finally confessed. Holmes looked at the cylinders on the table. These recordings are all their confessions here. Yes, Drayton talked for hours. He told everything. How the money was offered, how they memorized the statement, how they lied in court. It's all here. Mercer picked up one of the cylinders and handed it to Holmes. Listen, hear it with your own ears. Holmes took the cylinder and placed it in a phonograph on the table. He turned the crank and a voice began to speak. Samuel Drayton's voice. Shaky, frightened, yet somehow relieved. I confess, 20 years ago I lied in court. They offered me money, £50. It was a lot of money back then. I was poor, in debt, and I accepted. I memorized the statement. I said it in court. I looked 3 men in the face and lied. I knew they were innocent, but I said it anyway. I still remember Arthur Mercer's eyes when he looked at me in court. I knew he was innocent. There was no fear in his eyes, only bewilderment. He couldn't understand why I lied. I don't understand either. I haven't understood for 20 years. It's unforgivable, I know. 3 men died because of me. If my mother were here, she would die of shame. Maybe I should die. Maybe that's the only way out. The voice fell silent. Holmes turned off the phonograph. His face was expressionless, but something had changed in his eyes. Drayton committed suicide, Holmes said slowly. You didn't give him the poison. He drank it himself. Yes, I only told the truth, and the truth killed him. Holmes stood up and began pacing the workshop. He looked at the photographs on the walls. Arthur Mercer's young face, Rose Mercer's pale beauty, and little Daniel, smiling among his family. When was this photo taken? Holmes asked. Mercer looked at the photograph. His eyes softened. 1868. A year before my father's execution, our last family photo. You look happy. We were happy, Mercer said, his voice breaking. We were poor, but we were happy. My father was a good man. He never hurt anyone, and they killed him. For money. Holmes turned and looked at Mercer. I understand you, Holmes said quietly. Your anger, your pain, your sense of injustice, I understand it all. But Daniel, murder is murder. You killed Hale. That makes you a murderer too. Mercer bowed his head. I know. And Kerr, will you kill him too? There was a long silence. Mercer looked at the music box. His fingers traced the wooden surface. Kerr is different, he said finally. The others denied it. Drayton didn't deny it, but the others did. But Kerr was already sorry. I saw it when I watched him. Every night he would sit at his window and look out. There was pain on his face. Real pain. Will you forgive him? Mercer lifted his head. There was a complex expression in his eyes. Forgiving isn't my job. It's my father's job. But my father is dead, so I don't know. I really don't know. Holmes made a decision. He was going to take a gamble. Come with me, said Holmes. Turn yourself in. Present these records to the court. Bring justice to your father, but through legal means. No more bloodshed. Mercer looked at Holmes. A long, deep look. Why should I trust you? You're part of the system too. The system that killed my father 20 years ago. I'm not part of the system, said Holmes. I'm part of the truth. And the truth will reveal your father's innocence. With these records, these confessions, the case can be reopened. Your father's name can be cleared. But for that, you need to be alive and free. Mercer thought. Long, heavy minutes passed. Then the door slammed. Both turned. Lestrade and 4 police officers stood at the door. Their guns were drawn. "Nobody move!" Lestrade shouted. Holmes raised his hands. "Lestrade, wait! The situation is under control." But Lestrade wasn't listening. He signalled to his men, and the officers advanced toward Mercer. Mercer's face changed. Despair, anger, resignation, all at once. "Mr. Holmes," Mercer said as the officers arrested him, "promise me, present these records in court, clear my father's name." Holmes nodded. "I promise." As Mercer was led out, Holmes looked at the cylinders on the table. 20 years of truth was hidden in those small metal cylinders, and that truth would finally come to light. That night, an operation was carried out at Thomas Kerr's house. Holmes was right. Mercer had planned to visit Kerr that night. At the house, a package was found in front of the door. Inside was a music box, and inside the box, a small note. "I didn't kill him. I made him listen to the truth. Now you listen too." Kerr was taken into police custody without opening the package. He was trembling, but there was a strange sense of relief in his eyes. "Is it over?" Kerr asked Holmes. "Is it really over?" Holmes shook his head. "It's over. Daniel Mercer has been caught." Tears streamed down Kerr's face. "Thank God. And what about his father? Arthur Mercer? What will happen to him?" Holmes looked at Kerr. The old man was crushed under the weight of 20 years of guilt. But he was still standing. He was still breathing. "The truth will come out," said Holmes. "Your father's name will be cleared. But you will have to confess too, Mr. Kerr. In court, in front of everyone." Kerr nodded. "I will. I will now. 20 years is too long. It's time to tell the truth." When he returned to Baker Street, Holmes sat down in front of the fireplace and fell into deep thought. Watson, still feverish but on his feet, came over to his friend. "What happened?" Watson asked. "Was Mercer caught?" "He was caught," Holmes said quietly. "But Watson, this case is one of the most tragic I've ever seen. The killer is the victim. The victims are the killers. And justice was delayed 20 years. Watson sat down and looked at his friend. "Do you understand, Mercer?" Holmes did not answer for a long time. Then he spoke slowly. "I understand. his anger, his pain, his sense of injustice. I understand it all. But understanding is not forgiveness. And murder, no matter the reason, is murder. The fire crackled in the fireplace. Shadows danced on the walls. "Tomorrow," said Holmes, "I will hand these records over to Lestrade, and the Mercer case will be reopened. Arthur Mercer's name will be cleared. But Daniel is still the murderer, and he will pay the price." Watson nodded. "Justice." "Yes," said Holmes, but there was no usual certainty in his voice. "Justice." Outside, dawn was breaking over London. A new day was beginning. And a 20-year-old lie was finally coming to an end. Chapter 7. The Rule of Silence. The day after Daniel Mercer's arrest, London awoke to a completely different world. Newspapers had splashed the story across their front pages. But this time, there was much more to it than the headline, "Ghost Killer Caught." The Daily Telegraph, under Edwin Marsh's byline, had published all the details of the case from 20 years ago. How Arthur Mercer, James Holloway and Peter Crane had been executed based on false testimony. How the witnesses had lied for money. How justice had been murdered. Everything was recounted column by column, page by page. Holmes frowned as he read the newspaper. "How did this information leak out?" Watson asked at the breakfast table. "It must have been one of Lestrade's men," said Holmes. "Or Marsh found his own sources. Journalists always find the information they want to leak." Watson took the newspaper and began to read. Marsh's article was emotional and powerful. He portrayed Daniel Mercer not as a monster, but as a victim of the system. A son sought justice for his father and found none. In the end, he created his own justice. "This is a dangerous narrative," said Holmes. "The public might sympathize with Mercer." And so it did. In the days that followed, London was divided. On one side were those who defended law and order. To them, Daniel Mercer was a murderer, no matter how tragic his past. He was responsible for the deaths of 3 people and must serve his sentence. Justice belonged in the hands of the courts, not individuals. On the other side were those who sympathized with Mercer. To them, the real murderers were the false witnesses who had executed innocent people 20 years ago. Mercer had avenged his father, and this was an understandable reaction. Some declared him a folk hero. Debates erupted on street corners. People discussed the Mercer case in cafes, bars, and factories. Newspapers published new angles, new interpretations, and new revelations every day. Holmes remained silent amid the chaos. He rarely left Baker Street. He was thinking, analyzing, and waiting, because the real test had yet to come. A week after Mercer's arrest, the Crown Prosecution Service made a historic decision. The 1869 Mercer-Holloway Crane case would be reopened. This decision shook London like an earthquake. A 20-year-old case, a 20-year-old verdict, a 20-year-old truth would be questioned. The British justice system would face its own mistake. The trial would take place at the Old Bailey. The same courtroom had sentenced 3 innocent men to death 20 years earlier. Now, that same courtroom would question that decision. Holmes was called to testify at the trial. The audio recordings he found in Mercer's workshop were the most important evidence in the case. And Holmes would explain the authenticity and context of these recordings. On the first day of the trial, the courtroom was packed. Journalists, lawyers, curious onlookers. Everyone was there. The gallery was overflowing with people. Daniel Mercer sat in the defendant's chair. His hands were cuffed, but there was no fear on his face, only a weary acceptance. Thomas Kerr was there too. He was at the witness stand, preparing to confess to his 20-year-old crime. And Holmes was in the front row, watching everything. The prosecutor presented his case in his opening statement. Your Honours, members of the jury, today we are not judging an ordinary murder case, but a crime committed against justice. Daniel Mercer killed 3 people, or caused their deaths. That is a fact. But at the same time, another crime was committed in this court 20 years ago. 3 innocent men were executed based on false testimony. That is also a fact. The prosecutor paused for a moment and looked around the courtroom. Today, we will judge both truths: Daniel Mercer's crime and the murder of Justice 20 years ago, because one cannot be understood without the other. The defense attorney also made his opening statement. He recounted Mercer's tragic story. A child who lost his father at 12, saw his mother go mad, grew up in an orphanage. The attorney was calling on the jury not to excuse Mercer, but to understand him. Is my client a murderer? Yes, technically yes. He is responsible for Victor Hale's death. We do not deny that. But Daniel Mercer is also a victim of the system that killed his father 20 years ago. The first witness was Thomas Kerr. The old man's legs trembled as he took the stand. His face was pale and his eyes betrayed 20 years of guilt. The prosecutor began his questions. Mr. Kerr, you testified in the 1869 Edward Blackstone murder case. Is that correct? Yes, said Kerr, his voice barely audible. And in that testimony, you stated that you saw Arthur Mercer, James Holloway, and Peter Crane near the scene of the crime on the night of the murder. Is that also correct? Kerr remained silent for a long time. Then he took a deep breath. No, he said, that is not true. I lied. The courtroom erupted in a murmur. The judge banged his gavel to restore silence. Continue, Mr. Kerr. Tears began to stream down Kerr's cheeks. I didn't see anyone that night. No one. A man came to me, I don't know his name, and offered me £50. That was a lot of money back then. My wife was sick. I had debts. And I accepted. The man taught me what to say. He wrote a statement. I repeated that statement in court. And the other witnesses, Drayton, Hale, Whitmore? We all did the same thing. The same person had us all write the same statement. We all took the money, and we all lied. Silence. Deep, heavy, suffocating silence. Kerr continued, his voice breaking. 3 men died because of me. Arthur Mercer, James Holloway, Peter Crane. I didn't even know them, but I killed them. I killed them with my words. And for 20 years, I've seen their faces every night. The defense attorney interrupted. Mr. Kerr, do you remember who forced you to make this statement? Kerr shook his head. No, the man had his face covered. He just gave me the money and left. I never saw him again. Then why are you confessing today that you gave this statement, that you lied? Kerr looked at Daniel Mercer in the defendant's chair. Their eyes met. 2 men on opposite sides of a 20-year tragedy. Because, said Kerr, it's time to tell the truth, even if it's too late, even if it's too painful. Daniel Mercer wanted justice for his father, and I owe him that justice. Holmes's testimony took place on the second day of the trial. When he took the stand, the courtroom fell completely silent. Everyone was eager to hear what the great detective would say. The prosecutor began his questions. "Mr. Holmes, you found audio recordings in Daniel Mercer's workshop. Could you describe the content of these recordings?" Holmes answered calmly. "The recordings contain the confessions of 4 witnesses: Samuel Drayton, Victor Hale, Iris Whitmore, and Thomas Kerr. All 4 admit that they lied in court 20 years ago. They admit that they gave false testimony in exchange for money, and that they knew Arthur Mercer and the others were innocent. Are you certain of the authenticity of these recordings?" "Yes. I conducted a voice analysis. The recordings match the voices of the individuals involved. Additionally, the content aligns with known historical facts." The defense attorney intervened. "Mr. Holmes, what do you think of my client, Daniel Mercer?" Holmes paused for a moment. Then he spoke. "Daniel Mercer spent 20 years trying to prove his father's innocence. He found witnesses, obtained confessions, and sought justice. That's commendable determination. But—" Holmes paused and looked at Mercer. "But he also killed Victor Hale. That murder, no matter how understandable the motive, is still murder. The law does not permit individuals to create their own justice. It cannot, because then society descends into chaos. So, do you think justice was served?" Holmes remained silent for a long time. The room held its breath. "Justice," Holmes said finally, "is a complex concept. 20 years ago in this courtroom, justice was murdered. 3 innocent men were executed. Now, 20 years later, that mistake is being attempted to be corrected, but Arthur Mercer, James Holloway, and Peter Crane will not return. Their families, their pain, cannot be undone. In that sense, no. Justice cannot be fully served. Only the truth can come to light." The trial lasted 3 weeks. Witnesses were heard, evidence was examined, arguments were presented. The jury deliberated for hours. Finally, 2 separate rulings were announced. The first, the 1869 Mercer-Holloway Crane case, was declared invalid. The convictions of Arthur Mercer, James Holloway, and Peter Crane were overturned. 20 years after their deaths, the 3 men were officially declared innocent. When the decision was announced, a murmur rose in the courtroom. Some applauded, some cried. Daniel Mercer, sitting in the defendant's chair, smiled for the first time when he heard his father's name cleared. A small, weary, but genuine smile. Second verdict. Daniel Mercer was found guilty of Victor Hale's murder. Taking into account aggravating circumstances, premeditated murder, and mitigating circumstances, emotional trauma, provocation, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. Mercer listened to the verdict calmly. There was no surprise or anger on his face, only acceptance. As his sentence was read, he looked at Holmes. His eyes expressed gratitude, silent, deep, final. Holmes nodded slightly, a greeting, a farewell. After the trial, newspapers wrote about the Mercer case for days. Public opinion remained divided. Some found the verdict fair. Mercer was a murderer and would serve his sentence. But at the same time, his father's name had been cleared. Both sides had gained something. Others found the verdict insufficient. Those who had given false testimony 20 years ago, except for Kerr, were already dead. Drayton, Hale, and Whitmore had gone without serving their true sentences. And Kerr, considering his old age and remorse, had received only a 2-year prison sentence. "Is this justice?" asked the Times editorial. 3 innocent men were executed, and the perpetrators went almost unpunished. Daniel Mercer will serve a life sentence, but what about the real culprits? Where are they? Holmes sank into thought as he read these questions. Who was the real culprit? The person who arranged the witnesses, wrote the statements, caused this whole tragedy? That man, whoever he was never found. Perhaps he was long dead. Perhaps he was still alive, his identity hidden, his crime unknown. Who really killed Edward Blackstone? That question also remained unanswered. Some cases were simply unsolvable. Some questions remained unanswered forever, and some wounds never fully healed. A week after the Mercer case was closed, Holmes and Watson visited a small cemetery outside London. The cemetery was on a quiet hill, far from the city's noise. Old trees, moss-covered gravestones, a peaceful atmosphere. Holmes stopped in front of a specific grave. The stone read, Arthur Mercer, 1837 to 1869. Died innocent, not forgotten. Beside it were two more graves, James Holloway and Peter Crane. All three had lain there side by side in silence for 20 years. Holmes looked at the gravestone, a long, deep gaze. "What are you thinking?" Watson asked quietly. Holmes waited a long time before answering. The wind rustled the leaves of the trees. "I'm thinking about justice," Holmes said finally. "True justice. Not human justice, but universal justice. Does such a thing exist, or is it just an illusion we've created?" Watson came over to his friend. "Are you philosophizing?" Holmes smiled slightly, but there was sadness in his smile. "This case has shaken me, Watson. Cases are usually a matter of logic, evidence, clues, conclusions. But this was different. This case went beyond logic. It touched on the dark corners of human nature, the boundlessness of pain, the fragility of justice." Watson nodded. "Daniel Mercer, are you thinking about him?" "Him too, but more his father, Arthur Mercer. He woke up one morning, started a normal day, and that night he was arrested. A few weeks later, he was executed. He died knowing he was innocent. And for 20 years, the world remembered him as a murderer." Holmes touched the gravestone. The stone was cold, worn by time. "Now his name is cleared. But what does that do for him? He's dead. His wife is dead. His son is in prison. This family was torn apart 20 years ago, and now there's just a gravestone left." Watson placed his hand on his friend's shoulder. "You did everything you could, Holmes. You uncovered the truth." "Yes," said Holmes, "but the truth isn't always enough. Sometimes the truth only brings more pain." Both of them remained silent for a long time. The wind had died down, and the cemetery was enveloped in a deep silence. Then Holmes pulled a small object from his pocket. A watch, an antique, brass-plated pocket watch. "This," said Holmes, "I found in Mercer's workshop. It belonged to Arthur Mercer. Daniel had kept his father's watch for years." Holmes opened the watch. On the inner cover there was a hand-carved inscription, "To my son Daniel. Time passes, truth remains. Your father." Watson read the inscription and his eyes filled with tears. Holmes placed the watch in front of Arthur Mercer's gravestone. The ticking of the watch pierced the silence. Time has finally stopped," Holmes said quietly. When they returned to Baker Street, night had fallen. Holmes sat down in his usual chair opposite the fireplace. Watson sat across from him in his usual spot. The fire was burning in the fireplace, but there was a chill in the room. The lingering trace of the Mercer case was still in the air. Watson looked at his friend. "You want to say something?" What is it? Holmes stared at the fire for a long time. The flames danced, shadows twisted on the walls. This case, Holmes said finally, taught me something or reminded me. Justice is fragile, man-made, prone to human error, a lie, a bribe, a mistake, and the innocent die, the guilty escape, and the truth. The truth is buried beneath the earth. But you uncovered the truth, this time. But how many cases are there where the truth never comes out? How many Arthur Mercers are there whose names are never cleared? How many Daniel Mercers are there who seek their father's justice and never find it? Holmes looked at Watson. There was weariness in his eyes, but also a resolve. That's why I do this work, Watson. Not for money, not for fame. For the truth. Because the truth is more important than justice. Justice can be wrong, but the truth never changes. And someone must seek the truth. There must be a candle in the darkness. Watson smiled. You are that candle. Holmes shook his head. No, I'm just continuing to search. And I hope that one day this world will learn to put truth before justice. The fire crackled in the fireplace. Outside, London's streets had grown quiet. Holmes stood up and walked to the window. He parted the curtain and looked out. The moon was peeking through the clouds. Stars twinkled beyond the city lights. Daniel Mercer, said Holmes, looking out, fought for his father, with the wrong methods, but he fought. And in the end, he cleared his father's name. Is this a victory, a tragedy? I don't know. Perhaps both. Watson also stood up and came over to his friend. What do you feel about him? Holmes thought for a long time. Then he answered, respect and sorrow. This man lived for 20 years with a single purpose. And he achieved that purpose, but the price was too high. His freedom, his life, everything. Do you think he regrets it? Holmes shrugged. I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. Some people are willing to sacrifice everything for their goals. And Daniel Mercer, he was one of those people. Silence fell. The two friends stood side by side, gazing at London's night skyline. Then, from somewhere, the sound of a clock came. Tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. Holmes turned and looked at the wall in the room. Next to the fireplace hung an antique wall clock. The pendulum swung, the mechanism ticking. But suddenly, the clock stopped. The pendulum stopped swinging. The sound ceased. Silence filled the room. Holmes looked at the clock. The dial showed midnight. 12, the end of a day, the beginning of a new beginning. Strange, said Watson. Why did the clock stop? Holmes smiled, a small, weary, but peaceful smile. Perhaps, said Holmes, some stories end this way, in silence, with a stopped clock. And perhaps this is the most fitting end. Watson didn't understand, but he didn't ask. Some things are understood without explanation. Holmes returned to his chair and closed his eyes. Exhaustion had finally caught up with him. Good night, Watson, said Holmes before drifting off to sleep. Good night, Holmes. And 221 B. Baker Street fell silent. Outside, London slept. The streets were empty, the houses dark. Only the moon watched over the city through the clouds. Somewhere, in a prison cell, Daniel Mercer was also sleeping, for the first time in 20 years, without a nightmare. And in a cemetery, before 3 gravestones, a small pocket watch lay still. It no longer worked, but the inscription on the stone glowed in the moonlight. Time passes, truth remains. and the truth, finally, had come to light. The end.